Sunday, April 14th, the fated day dawns. Although the outward southern track skirted to the south of the main sea ice areas, it was well known that icebergs were still likely to be encountered, particularly in the months of April, May, and June. Sure enough, at 9 a.m. on Sunday, April 14th, the Marconi operators received Morse code messages from Captain Barr, commanding the steamship Caronia, saying, "Captain, Titanic, westbound steamers report bergs, growlers, and field ice in 42 degrees north from 49 degrees to 51 degrees west. 14th April, compliments, Barr." This was almost exactly where the Titanic was headed. During the course of that day, half a dozen more messages containing warnings of ice ahead were received by the radio operators. All messages about navigation were supposed to be passed on to the ship's captain, who should have made sure that they were posted in the chart room on the ship's bridge, so that all the officers would be able to read them. There was no proper system in place to do this, however. Some of the messages certainly did reach the captain. One from the Baltic was handed to the Captain Smith at about 2 in the afternoon, although not posted on the chart room until 7:15 that evening. Some, though, almost certainly never left the Marconi room. Evening falls. Even though not all the messages had gotten through to them, the ship's officers knew to be on the lookout for ice. They had an added warning since the temperature started to drop very sharply after sunset. Although there was virtually no wind, this was good, though not certain, a sign that there was ice around. For the first part of the evening, everything went normally. All the Titanic's boilers had been fired up, and she was now steaming ahead at 22 knots. At 9 p.m., the captain, who had been dining with some of the first-class passengers, came to the bridge and discussed the conditions with Second Officer Charles Lightoller, who had been on watch since 6 p.m. They both agreed that the very calm sea and the fact that there was no moon might make it difficult to spot any icebergs, especially ones that had recently turned over. These looked black or dark blue rather than white, and would not show up easily in the starlight. If there had been any wind, even a slight breeze, there would have been waves lapping around the base of the bergs, forming white breakers that would have been much easier to spot from a distance. At 9:30 p.m., the captain retired to his cabin on the boat deck, saying, If it becomes at all doubtful, let me know. I will be just inside." Immediately after this, Lightoller sent a message to the 2 lookouts in the crow's nest to keep a sharp eye out for ice, particularly growlers, which are small icebergs that barely show above the surface. In the Marconi room, the chief operator, Jack Phillips, was busy clearing a backlog of passenger messages when he received a communication at 9:40 p.m. from the Mesaba mentioning heavy packed ice and a great number of large icebergs in the area directly ahead of the Titanic. But again, the information did not find its way to the officers on the duty. At 10 o'clock, the watch changed. Lookouts Archie Jewell and George Summons handed over to Reginald Lee and Frederick Fleet, taking care to pass on Lightoller's instructions. In the difficult conditions, it seemed a particular shame that the crow's nest binoculars were missing. Down below on the bridge, First Officer William Murdoch took over from Lightoller. The message ignored. Jack Phillips was still in the Marconi room sending messages for passengers at 11 p.m. Suddenly, a ship, the Californian, burst in from close by with a message that went, "Say, OM, we are surrounded by ice and stopped." OM was short for old man, which was how the operators addressed each other. Phillips, evidently tired after a long day and irritated by being interrupted, snapped back, Shut up, I'm busy. I'm working at Cape Race." He meant he was sending messages to Cape Race, a transmitting station on the land in Newfoundland. He seemed to have ignored the California's message and gone on with his work. Over on the Californian, the Marconi operator, Cyril Evans, did not bother to reply, but turned off his machine and went to bed. the final hours. It is hard to piece together exactly what happened next during the last 2 or 3 hours that the Titanic was afloat. Pretty much everything that we know is based on accounts of survivors. In the confusion and mounting panic, it's not surprising that the stories often do not quite add up and that different people tell different versions of events. Still, there are things that everyone more or less agrees on, and there is no strong reason to disbelieve. Iceberg ahead, 11:39 p.m. Just before 20 to midnight from his position in the crow's nest, Fred Fleet thought he saw something indistinct straight ahead. Rapidly getting closer, he quickly rang the bell above his head 3 times, the signal for an object ahead. He then picked up the telephone and called the bridge. Iceberg right ahead. Murdoch at once gave the order, hard a starboard, to the steersman, and phoned down to the engine rooms, ordering stop, full speed astern. Putting the engines into reverse and turning the wheel to starboard had the effect of slowing the ship down and turning her to the left. At the same time as issuing these orders, Murdoch had pulled the lever and automatically closed the watertight doors in the bulkhead. 11:40 p.m. Slowly, the ship began to swing to the left. The iceberg loomed even closer. To the lookouts, it seemed as if the turn was too slow and a head-on collision was inevitable. But at the last second, the Titanic's bow passed to the left of the berg. Perhaps the turn had been enough. It was a close shave, though, and the immense black shape seemed to brush against the ship as it glided swiftly past and then disappeared into the night. The whole incident had taken scarcely a minute. Over the ship, people felt something. All over the ship, people felt something, although few knew what. The passengers later described it as a feeling as if the ship had just run over 1,000 marbles. Another said as if it had been hit with a heavy wave, while Lucy Duff Gordon said it was as though someone had drawn a giant finger along the ship's side. Captain Smith eventually realized that something had happened. He rushed onto the bridge and asked what the ship had hit. An iceberg, sir, replied Murdoch. At 11:50 p.m., to most people on board, it seemed as if whatever had happened could not be that serious. Deep down inside the ship, it was a very different matter. In boiler room number 6, toward the front of the ship, there had been a loud crash, and seawater had suddenly started to pour in along the right-hand side. Almost immediately, the watertight doors in the bulkheads had begun to close. 2 men, fireman Fred Barrett and engineer James Hesketh, had just enough time to dash through the doorway to boiler room under number 5 before the door slammed shut behind them. Other men had to clamber up emergency ladders and escape through hatchways in the ceiling. Further forward, water was flooding into the area where the mail was stored and sorted, and it was starting to seep into some of the third-class cabins and firemen's sleeping quarters. 12 o'clock a.m. As soon as it became clear on the bridge that the ship was taking on water, the captain called for Thomas Andrews, and the 2 of them made an inspection below decks. When Captain Smith returned to the bridge, it was obvious he knew the ship was doomed. In its passing, the iceberg had opened up the side of the ship below the waterline in the first 6 of the watertight compartments, along that length of some 100 yards or so. The hole in the 6th compartment was tiny, a gash some 23 inches long near the bulkhead, and could easily be dealt with by the pumps. But the damage to the other compartments was more severe, and water was rushing in at an unstoppable rate. As these compartments filled, the weight of the water was gradually pulling the front of the ship down. Eventually, the water would start to spill over the bulkhead, separating the 5th compartment from the 6th, which in turn would start to fill, pulling the ship even farther down at the front. Soon, the 7th compartment would start to flood, and then the 8th. 12:05 a.m. At around 5 past midnight, an order given to uncover the lifeboats. At a quarter past midnight, the captain told the Marconi officer to send the International Distress Call, CQD. And the call was picked by the Cape Race picked up by Cape Race and several ships that responded almost immediately saying that they were changing course and heading for the Titanic. Unfortunately, all of them were several hours steaming away. At 25 past midnight, the wireless operator of the Carpathia, who had not heard the first call, sent a casual message to the Titanic. Immediately, Phillips, the chief Marconi operator, shot back, "Come at once. We have struck a berg and require immediate assistance. It's a CQD. OM." Soon, the Carpathia responded that she was about 50 miles away and coming as fast as she could. The Marconi operators continued to transmit desperate calls for help, at one point using the new SOS signal as well as the traditional CQD. Abandoned ship, 12:45 a.m. At about 1:45, Quartermaster George Rowe began sending up distress rockets at regular intervals from the position at the front of the boat dock. These shot into the air and exploded in a cascade of white stars. It seemed that rockets were seen by crew on the Californian, still stuck in ice to the north, but for one reason or another, Stanley Lord, the Californian captain, took no action. When the Marconi operators were busy at their machine, efforts were being made to rouse the passengers and crew, get them into life jackets, and start loading the 20 lifeboats. It was by all accounts a slow start. Gradually, though, more and more first and second class passengers began to emerge from their staterooms and gather on the docks and in the public rooms. Most had been in bed at the time of the collision. Some had just on their bedclothes, perhaps with a coat flung on over the top, while others had carefully dressed themselves in layer upon layer of warm clothing. The Titanic's musicians, led by Wallace Hartley, hastily assembled in the first-class lounge and began playing lively ragtime tunes. 12:45 a.m. Of course, Thomas Andrews, Bruce Ismay, and the senior officers had known from the start that there weren't nearly enough places in the lifeboats for all of the people on board the Titanic. But it's pretty certain that at this stage, hardly anyone else, not even most of the crew, realized this. The evacuation was not very organized. Each lifeboat had designated crew members who were supposed to man it if it had to be launched, but often men had not checked on the list and did not know which boat was theirs. Charles Lightoller took overall charge of the lifeboats on the left-hand side of the boat deck, and William Murdoch did of those on the right. Their job was to ensure that the boats were manned, loaded passengers into them, and see them safely launched, while at the same time keeping order and making sure the panic did not break out. None of this was easy. To start with, few people appreciated the danger they were in. Wasn't the Titanic supposed to be pretty much unsinkable? Even when the seriousness of the situation began to dawn, for many people it seemed more sensible to stay on board rather than risk casting themselves off into the dark and icy Atlantic in a rickety little lifeboat. Still, at about the same time as the SOS was being sent, the first lifeboat was launched. The order for filling the boats was strictly women and children first. For Lightoller, this meant that no male passengers whatsoever should be allowed into the lifeboat. Well, Murdoch eventually decided that if there were no women or children nearby, a few male passengers might be allowed on. The first half dozen boats to be launched had almost entirely first-class passengers and some crew members in them. None of them was anywhere near full. The worst was number 1, which was launched from Murdoch's side of the ship at about 10 past 1. It contained just 7 crew members and 4 first-class passengers. Later boats generally had more people in them and a higher proportion of second and third-class passengers. As the Titanic bow sank even farther into the water, and it became increasingly obvious that there were enough lifeboats, the scene became more and more desperate. Margaret Brown later told how she willingly pushed forward and dropped into lifeboat number 6 before she had time to protest. She was willingly pushed. 1:50 a.m. By about 10 to 2, the forecast deck at the front of the ship had disappeared underwater. 10 minutes later, the water had reached a deck just below the boat deck. The last lifeboat to be successfully launched from the davits, collapsible lifeboat D, was lowered into the sea at about 5 past 2, and almost immediately afterward, water started to pour into the boat deck at the front end. At this point, men were still struggling with collapsible lifeboat A and B, which had been heaved off the roof of the officers' quarters. Amazingly, the lights on the ship were still blazing. Engineers under Chief Engineer Joseph Bell worked until the very last minute in the engine room, determined to keep the power going. The Marconi operators continued frantically tapping out messages. The last one received by another ship was sent at 10 past 2. Hundreds and hundreds of people had gathered on the deck. Some were praying, some weeping and crying for help. Others just huddled silently together. The ship's band was standing near the base of the second funnel, playing a solemn tune, probably the hymn, Nearer, My God, to Thee. 2:15 a.m. At about 2:15, the bridge at the front of the boat deck sank underwater. This put tremendous strain on the cables securing the forward funnel. One by one, they snapped, and, with a groan, the funnel broke away. Charles Lightroller, who was on the roof of the officers' quarter at the time, recalled that the ship then gave a sudden lurch, creating a wave that washed about 2 remaining collapsible lifeboats off deck. Shortly afterward, a loud rumbling sound, like distant thunder, was heard emanating from the deep down in the bowels of the ship. By now, the lights had finally gone out, and everything was in darkness. The back end, while the front end had disappeared from view. Some survivors maintained at this point the ship's stern seemed to settle back down into the water for a while, while others, including Lightroller, disagreed and instead remembered the ship continued to tip up ever more steeply. Whatever the case, the end now came very fast. By 20 past 2, the last vestiges of the Titanic had slipped between the surface of the Atlantic.